The first time Daniel saw the building, it looked harmless enough. Old, yes. Its bricks faded to a tired gray, its windows dusty and some cracked, but it had a certain solemn dignity, like an elderly man standing straight despite the weight of years. He had been searching for an affordable apartment in the city for weeks, and when the landlord told him the rent was less than half of anything else in the area, he thought his luck had finally changed. Cheap rent in a decent location, utilities included. All he had to do was ignore the rumors he had laughed off at first. Strange disappearances, tenants who left in the middle of the night without taking their belongings. Whispers of footsteps echoing in the corridors long after midnight. It all sounded like urban legends meant to scare newcomers, and Daniel didn't scare easily. At least not back then. Moving in was easy. The landlord, a wiry man with tired eyes, barely said a word. He handed Daniel the key, muttered, "Third floor, room 306, and left before Daniel could ask about trash collection or laundry facilities. The building smelled faintly of damp plaster and something metallic, like old coins or dried blood. The air was cooler inside than it should have been, almost as if the walls were breathing, sighing out cold drafts that found their way under Daniel's jacket. The corridor stretched on longer than he expected. The overhead lights flickered in places, buzzing faintly, and his footsteps echoed as though the hallway were empty for miles in both directions. He tried to laugh at himself when the sound of his steps seemed to double, like someone was walking just behind him. But every time he stopped, the echo stopped too. Room 306 wasn't much. A small kitchen that smelled faintly of mildew, a living room with a threadbare carpet, a bedroom with a crooked window looking out onto the narrow street below. But it was his, and for the first time in months, Daniel felt like he had somewhere he could settle. He unpacked his boxes, set up his laptop on the chipped desk, and by nightfall, he had convinced himself that the eerie feeling of the place was nothing more than the strangeness of moving into a new environment. That first night, he slept restlessly. The building was never silent. He could hear pipes groaning deep in the walls, the creak of footsteps on the floor above him, and, somewhere far down the corridor, the faint sound of shoes tapping against the old wooden floor. He rolled over, telling himself it was just another tenant coming home late. But when he glanced at the clock, the glowing numbers read 3:14 a.m. The tapping continued for nearly an hour, sometimes drawing closer, sometimes receding, but never quite reaching his door. By morning, the unease seemed foolish. He laughed at himself in the mirror, splashed water on his face, and reminded himself that every new place felt strange at first. He grabbed coffee from a nearby cafe and returned to find an elderly woman standing near the entrance of the building. She looked at him sharply, as though memorizing his face. "You moved into 306, she said, in a voice that was both matter-of-fact and heavy with warning. "Yes," Daniel replied, startled. "I just moved in yesterday. Why?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She leaned on her cane, eyes narrowing. "Be careful at night. Don't open your door if you hear knocking." Daniel blinked. "Excuse me?" But she was already turning away, muttering to herself as she shuffled down the street. For the rest of the day, he tried not to think about her. He set up his internet connection, bought groceries, and even explored the neighborhood a little. The building seemed almost normal in daylight. He passed a man on the second floor carrying laundry, a woman whispering on her phone by the stairwell. He felt a surge of relief. People lived here, real people, and he wasn't alone in some forgotten relic of the city. That night, however, the corridor seemed to stretch longer than ever. He locked his door, checked it twice, and lay in bed with his laptop open, watching videos to distract himself. Around midnight, he heard it again, the footsteps. Slow, steady, coming from far away down the hall. At first, he tried to ignore it. He turned up the volume on his laptop, forced himself to focus. But the steps grew louder, echoing in that uncanny way that made it impossible to tell if they were one hallway away or just outside his door. His chest tightened. He muted his laptop, held his breath, and listened. The steps stopped. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. Then softly came a knock. 3 raps, deliberate and slow, right at his door. Daniel's heart pounded. He thought of the old woman's warning, her voice telling him not to open it. He sat frozen, staring at the door. The knock came again, a little louder this time, the wood vibrating faintly. "Who's there?" he called, hating the tremor in his voice. No answer. He stood, moving quietly toward the door. His hand hovered over the knob. He told himself it could be a neighbor, someone needing help. But his instincts screamed otherwise. Instead of opening the door, he lowered his eye to the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. He staggered back, breath catching. The knocking had been right there, he was certain of it. And yet no one was in sight. He backed into his bedroom, locked that door too, and sat awake until dawn, flinching at every creak and groan of the building. The next day, he told himself he'd imagined it. Sleep deprivation, stress, suggestions planted by the old woman. But a nagging unease lingered. He wanted to ask the other tenants if they had heard anything, but whenever he saw them, they avoided his gaze. The man with the laundry passed him on the stairs without a nod. The woman on her phone stopped speaking when he entered and quickly walked away. That evening, he decided to test himself. He turned off his lights, sat quietly in the living room, and waited. Midnight came, then 1 o'clock. Just as he was beginning to feel foolish, the footsteps began again. This time, instead of staying frozen, he grabbed his phone and pressed record. He wanted proof, something he could play back in the morning to reassure himself it wasn't all in his head. The footsteps grew closer, echoing with that hollow rhythm that made his skin crawl. His phone picked up the sound, the faint tapping of soles against wood. He stared at the door, waiting. The knock came. 3 slow raps. He clenched the phone tighter, the recording app still running, and forced himself to call out. "Who's there?" Again, silence. Against all reason, against the old woman's warning, he reached for the knob. His hand trembled, sweat slicking his palm, but he turned it slowly, inch by inch, until the lock clicked open. When he pulled the door wide, the corridor stretched out before him, long and dim under the flickering lights. Empty. His heart thudded painfully. He lifted the phone, pointing its light down the hall. Nothing. Just cracked paint, doors shut tight, and shadows shifting faintly in the flicker of the bulbs. Then the phone slipped from his hand, because standing at the far end of the corridor was a figure. Pale, impossibly thin, with limbs too long for its body. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, as though its neck were broken. And even from that distance Daniel saw its eyes. 2 pale orbs glowing faintly white in the darkness. The figure didn't move. It just stood, watching him. Daniel stumbled backward into his apartment, slamming the door shut, fumbling to lock it again. His breath came in ragged gasps. He pressed his back against the door, every nerve in his body screaming that the thing was still there, waiting. For the rest of the night, he didn't move. He sat in the corner, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the door as the footsteps began again, slow and deliberate, pacing up and down the corridor outside. By the time dawn broke, the footsteps had ceased. The hallway outside was silent once more, but Daniel knew now that he hadn't imagined anything. The building was wrong, its corridors haunted not just by echoes but by something that watched and waited and knocked. And he had opened the door. Daniel didn't sleep the following night. The moment the sun dipped below the rooftops, his body tensed, his ears straining for the faintest sound from the hallway. He kept every light in the apartment on, though it made the shadows crowd thicker in the corners, stretching unnaturally along the walls. His phone sat on the table with the recording app ready, as if capturing proof would somehow protect him. The hours crawled. Every creak of the building made his nerves flare. At one point, the refrigerator hummed loudly, and he nearly dropped the mug of coffee trembling in his hand. Midnight came and went in taut silence. Then at 1:32 he heard it again, footsteps, slow, patient, unhurried. They came from far down the corridor, the sound echoing toward him like a predator stalking prey. He pressed record, staring at the door. His hand itched to grab the knob, but the memory of the figure at the far end of the hall stopped him cold. This time the knocking never came. The footsteps stopped just beyond his door, waiting, as if the thing on the other side knew he was listening, knew he was too afraid to open it again. The silence dragged on for what felt like hours. When dawn finally smeared pale light across his window, Daniel found himself shaking, his muscles stiff from remaining rigid all night. He couldn't live like this, not without answers. That morning, he marched downstairs, determined to confront the landlord. The office was a cramped space behind the lobby desk, and the landlord was there, hunched over paperwork. When Daniel entered, the man's eyes flicked up, sharp and guarded. "I need to ask you something," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's wrong with this building?" The landlord froze for a fraction of a second before his expression smoothed into practiced neutrality. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned on the desk. "The footsteps. The knocking. The figure in the corridor." His voice cracked on the last word, and he hated how desperate he sounded. "Don't pretend you don't know." "What's going on here?" The landlord sighed, rubbing his temples. "Every tenant thinks they're the first to notice. Listen, it's an old building. Old buildings make noises, echoes carry. That's all." "That's not all," Daniel snapped. "I saw something. Something standing at the end of the hallway." For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed the landlord's face. He lowered his voice. "Then you should leave." The bluntness of it stole Daniel's breath. "Leave? You rented me this apartment less than a week ago." "I rented it because you asked for cheap," the landlord said, voice flat. "Cheap comes with conditions. Some people stay, some don't." He paused, eyes darting toward the dim lobby as if someone else might be listening. "If you want your deposit back, I'll give it. But if you stay, don't open the door again." Daniel staggered out of the office, more unsettled than before. The landlord knew something. He was certain of it. And if the landlord knew, maybe the other tenants did too. On the second floor, he saw the man with the laundry again. This time, Daniel caught him before he could slip away. "Wait," Daniel said, blocking his path. "Have you heard it?" "The footsteps?" The man stiffened. His eyes flicked nervously down the hallway. "Keep your voice down, so you know." The man's lips pressed thin. He leaned in close, whispering. "It walks the corridor at night. Always has. Some say it's looking for someone to replace it. Others say it's feeding. All I know is..." "Don't answer it, ever." Before Daniel could ask more, the man shoved past him, hurrying away with his laundry bag bouncing against his back. That evening, Daniel sat in front of his laptop scouring the internet for anything about the building's history. There was surprisingly little. A few vague mentions of tenants disappearing over the decades. One forum post from 5 years ago. "My cousin lived at 306. He stopped answering calls, stopped going to work. When his family came to find him, the apartment was locked from the inside, empty. He was never found." Daniel's stomach knotted. Apartment 306. His apartment. He slammed the laptop shut, his heart pounding. He wanted to leave. Every rational instinct screamed at him to grab his things, run out into the night, and never look back. But he couldn't, not yet, because something deeper inside him, some stubborn, dangerous need to understand, held him there. That night he stayed awake again, the apartment bathed in harsh electric light. The footsteps came as expected, echoing steadily closer. But this time they didn't stop at his door. They kept going, moving past 306, fading into the distance. Relief flooded him for a moment, until he realized what that meant. Someone else's door. He opened his door just a crack, peering out. The corridor stretched long and dim, the bulbs flickering weakly. And at the far end he saw the pale figure again. Only this time it wasn't standing still. It was at a neighbor's door, its long fingers rapping softly, patiently. Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to warn whoever lived there not to answer. But his voice died in his chest as the door across the hall creaked open. The figure slipped inside without a sound. The door shut. Silence. Daniel's breath caught painfully. He waited, trembling, for the scream that never came. Minutes passed, then hours. Finally, as dawn broke, the door across the hall opened slowly, creaking outward. The figure stepped back into the corridor. Its pale eyes flicked toward Daniel's door. He slammed it shut before those eyes could lock onto him. For 2 days he didn't see the tenant from across the hall. Their door remained closed, silent. On the 3rd day, Daniel gathered the courage to knock. No answer. He knocked harder. Still nothing. He tried the handle. Locked. When he asked the landlord, the man only shrugged. Some tenants leave suddenly. Happens all the time, but Daniel knew. They hadn't left. The thing in the corridor had taken them. He began watching the hallway obsessively. Every night he sat by his door with the lights off, the peephole glowing faintly with the dim corridor beyond. He saw the figure pass, heard its footsteps echo endlessly. And each time it stopped at a door, his stomach turned to ice. On the 5th night, it came back to him. The knocking was soft, almost gentle. 3 slow raps. He pressed his eye to the peephole. The figure stood inches away, its pale face distorted by the curve of the glass. Its head twitched, tilting in sharp jerks. Its mouth opened slowly, impossibly wide, though no sound emerged. Its eyes burned white. Daniel stumbled back, choking on a cry. The knocking came again, louder now, rattling the wood. He clamped his hands over his ears, rocking in place, whispering, "Don't open, don't open, don't open." And then, suddenly, silence. He risked another glance. The corridor was empty. That morning, Daniel resolved to learn the truth. He searched city records, old newspapers, anything he could find. And slowly, a story emerged. The building had been constructed in the early 1900s. Almost immediately, there were reports of disappearances. Tenants vanishing without a trace, rooms left locked from the inside. In 1952, a family of 4 was found dead in their apartment, their bodies desiccated as though drained of every drop of fluid. The case was never solved. More disappearances followed until the building gained a reputation. Landlords changed, but the pattern remained. Cheap rent, new tenants, and eventually, silence. Daniel sat back from the records, his blood cold. The thing in the corridor had always been here. It wasn't a ghost, not in the usual sense. It was older, woven into the bones of the building itself, and it wanted him. That night, the knocking returned. But this time, instead of fear, Daniel felt something else, grim determination. He set up his phone, recording not just audio but video, propping it to capture the door. He wasn't going to be another disappearance whispered about online. He was going to face it, to prove it was real. The footsteps drew close, each tap of its soles like a countdown. Then the knock, 3 slow, deliberate raps. Daniel lifted the camera, his breath shallow. His hand hovered over the knob. The old woman's warning rang in his ears. "Don't open." But another voice inside whispered louder, "If you don't open, it will never end." His fingers closed on the knob. The knob turned in Daniel's trembling hand. For an instant he hesitated, sweat dripping down his temples, his chest hammering like a drum. He could almost hear the old woman's voice in his head, "Don't open." But his other hand clutched the phone, its tiny camera blinking red, capturing every second. If he didn't open now, he would never know the truth. The door creaked wide. The corridor stretched before him, empty under the flickering light. The air pressed heavy against his skin, cold and sour, smelling faintly of rust and mold. For a heartbeat he thought it was gone, that he had conjured everything in a haze of sleepless nights. Then at the far end the shadows rippled. It stepped forward, pale and impossibly thin, its arms too long, its head lolling to the side in broken angles. The light above it flickered harder, buzzing as though the electricity itself recoiled. Its eyes glowed white, catching his like hooks. Daniel couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at him to slam the door shut. But he stayed, the camera steady in his shaking hand. The thing began to walk. Slow, deliberate, each step ringing louder than it should, echoing off the cracked plaster walls. Closer and closer. Daniel wanted to retreat, to run, but his legs refused. It was like the creature's gaze pinned him in place, forcing him to watch. It stopped halfway down the corridor. Its mouth opened, stretching wider than a human mouth should, the jaw cracking with a sound like snapping twigs. No voice came. Instead, Daniel heard the sound inside his head, a whisper that wasn't a whisper, a thought that wasn't his. "Let me in." Daniel clutched his skull, a cry tearing from his throat. The words weren't spoken. They were inside him, burrowing deep. He stumbled backward, slamming the door shut with his shoulder. He locked it, bolted it, dragged the table against it. The whisper faded, but the echo lingered, like a parasite clinging to the walls of his mind. His phone had dropped in the chaos. When he retrieved it, his hands shaking, he pressed play on the video. The door, the empty corridor, the flickering light, it was all there. But where the creature had stood, the screen showed only warped static, as though the camera refused to capture it. He watched again and again, bile rising in his throat. Proof, he had thought, but the proof was gone. That morning, Daniel left the apartment for hours, wandering the streets aimlessly, afraid to return. The city bustled around him, people laughing, cars honking, life moving on as if nothing existed beyond the veil of ordinary. But to him it all felt fragile, unreal. The building's shadow followed him, clinging to his thoughts. He found himself back at the cafe where he had first seen the old woman. Miraculously, she was there again, sitting at the corner table with her cane leaning against the wall. Daniel approached her desperately, pulling out the chair opposite her before she could refuse. "You knew," he said. His voice was hoarse, his hands trembling. "You knew about it." The woman's eyes were tired, sunken deep into her wrinkled face. She sipped her tea before speaking. "And yet you opened the door." Daniel's breath caught. "What is it?" Her gaze locked on his, unflinching. "It's older than the building, older than the street it stands on. When they built the apartments, they built over something that should never have been disturbed. The corridor was never just a corridor, it's a passageway. It hungers. And once it notices you, it won't stop." Daniel's skin crawled. "Why me? Why my apartment?" "It doesn't matter who," she said quietly. "It goes where it wants. Sometimes it leaves people alone. Sometimes it doesn't. If you see it, if you hear it, that's enough. You've been chosen." His voice broke. "Then what do I do?" She shook her head slowly. "Leave while you can." But Daniel knew deep down that leaving wouldn't save him. The thing was inside his head now, whispering, pressing against the walls of his mind. Even if he ran, it would follow. That night, he didn't bother trying to sleep. He spread papers across the floor, the notes he had taken from old archives, the clippings he had copied from city records. He searched for patterns. Families disappearing in the 50s, tenants gone in the 70s, more recent vanishings, always from the same hall, always near his apartment. Around midnight, the footsteps began again. Daniel pressed his palms to his ears, rocking on the floor. The sound seeped through anyway, vibrating in his skull. When the knocking came, his body convulsed as though the sound itself had weight. "Let me in." This time, the voice inside him was stronger, more demanding. His hands twitched toward the door on their own. He had to grip the table with white-knuckled fists to keep himself still. Sweat drenched his shirt, his teeth grinding against each other. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, silence. He slumped to the floor, trembling violently. He knew he couldn't survive many more nights like this. It would break him, wear him down until he gave in. The next morning, he forced himself into the landlord's office again. The man looked up with weary resignation, as though he had been expecting Daniel. "You're still here," the landlord said flatly. Daniel slammed his palms on the desk. "You knew. You knew what was in that building and you put me there anyway." The landlord's jaw tightened. "Do you think anyone would live here if they knew?" "I tell myself maybe it won't choose them. Maybe they'll be lucky. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they stay years, never seeing it. But when it chooses..." He trailed off, his eyes haunted. "There's nothing anyone can do." "There has to be a way," Daniel insisted. "Something. You've been here long enough. You must have heard something." The landlord hesitated, then leaned in close. "I heard once, just a story, you understand, that it doesn't like mirrors, that it can't stand its own reflection. But don't ask me if it's true. I've never been stupid enough to test it." Daniel clung to the words like a drowning man to driftwood. Mirrors. Maybe there was a way to fight back. That evening, he bought every mirror he could find from thrift stores and hardware shops. By nightfall, his apartment walls gleamed with reflections. Bathroom mirrors, cheap plastic ones, even a full-length mirror propped against the door. His apartment became a house of glass. When the footsteps came, the air turned sharp and cold, pressing against his lungs. He sat rigid, waiting. The knocking shook the full-length mirror, rattling it against the door. Daniel forced himself to stare, his body rigid with terror. The mirror fogged faintly, as though something breathed on the other side. Then slowly the pale figure emerged in the glass. Its head twitched, its arms reaching, claws scraping the surface. But it couldn't cross. It struck the mirror, the sound reverberating like shattering bones. The glass trembled, but it didn't break. For the first time, Daniel saw rage in its glowing eyes. It leaned close to the reflection, its mouth opening wider and wider until the glass itself seemed to ripple. The voice in his head screamed, "Let me in! Let me in!" Daniel clutched his skull, howling in pain. But when he looked up again, the mirror was empty. The corridor was silent. He laughed then, broken and wild. He had found something. A weapon. But even as relief flooded him, dread coiled beneath it. The thing wasn't gone. It had only retreated. And it would come back. When it did, he would be ready. The days that followed blurred into one another as though time itself had grown distorted inside the building. Daniel kept to his apartment as much as possible, but the corridor refused to leave him alone. Every night, as soon as the sun set and the city outside dimmed into silence, the long stretch of hallway outside his door seemed to breathe. The shadows deepened faster there, swallowing the weak ceiling bulbs. At first he tried keeping his television on, raising the volume so the noise might drown out the whispers, but even then, when he muted the sound, he swore he could hear low murmurs seeping through the walls, murmurs of voices he did not recognize, sometimes begging, sometimes chuckling, always cut short just before he could make out the words. Sleep became a stranger. He would drift for an hour, only to jerk awake at the creak of floorboards in the hallway, at the thud of steps that never reached a destination. Sometimes he leapt from bed and flung open his apartment door, half expecting to catch someone mid-stride, but there was never anyone there. Only the empty corridor stretching on with a stillness that made his teeth grind. It was on the third night after his encounter with the old woman that Daniel noticed something peculiar about the building. He returned from a brief trip to the grocery store, arms full of essentials, and as he climbed the staircase, he realized he hadn't seen a single other tenant all day. Not a neighbor unlocking their door, not a child running up the steps, not even a stray sound of conversation muffled behind walls. It was as if the entire block of apartments had emptied out, leaving him utterly alone. Yet the trash bins still filled, newspapers still appeared on doorsteps, and at night the corridor still echoed with activity. Invisible tenants, shadows with routines. By now Daniel's rational mind had nearly broken under the weight of what was happening. He began documenting everything in a small leather notebook he had carried from his old home. On the first page he wrote, "The footsteps came at 2:17 a.m., stopped near my door, lingered for 4 minutes, then retreated." Another night he scribbled, "Scraping sound along the wall at 3:05 a.m., like fingernails dragging across plaster. Continued for 20 minutes. No damage on inspection in the morning." The more he wrote, the more he noticed a pattern. All events took place between midnight and dawn, and almost all of them centered around his unit. One evening, desperate for proof, he left his phone recording video outside the door, pointed squarely down the corridor. He let it run for hours, terrified but determined, and when he retrieved it the next morning, he discovered something that made his blood turn cold. The footage showed the corridor just as he'd left it, until precisely 2:15 a.m. At that moment, the hallway lights flickered once, and a dark blur seeped into the camera frame. It wasn't a shape exactly, not human, not animal. It was like watching a shadow detach from the wall, pooling into the middle of the corridor. As the minutes passed, the blur elongated into something vaguely humanoid, thin and impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling. The figure didn't walk. It simply stood facing his door. For nearly 20 minutes, the shadow lingered, utterly motionless, before collapsing into the floor and vanishing altogether. Daniel nearly dropped the phone. His first instinct was to delete the video, erase the evidence, pretend he had never seen it. But curiosity or perhaps madness won over. He watched the footage again and again, each time feeling his pulse quicken, his breath shorten. He couldn't deny it anymore. Something lived in the corridor. Something that waited for him. That night, unable to resist, he set his phone again outside the door, propped carefully, recording. He sat awake inside, clutching a kitchen knife like a talisman, whispering to himself that he wouldn't open the door, not this time. Hours dragged by, the silence punctuated by the occasional creak of wood. Then right on schedule came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavier than before. They approached and stopped just beyond his door, so close he could almost sense a presence leaning against it. The doorknob rattled once, softly as though something tested it from the other side. Daniel held his breath until his lungs burned. The rattling stopped, replaced by a single hollow knock. Then silence. When he dared check the video the next morning, he found not only the shadow figure but also something far worse. At 2:19 a.m., the frame captured his own door opening slightly. He knew he had locked it. He knew he had not moved from his bed. Yet the video showed the knob turning, the door creaking open by inches. A pale hand with elongated fingers reached into the gap, groped at the frame, then slowly withdrew. The door closed again. Daniel's stomach twisted violently as he replayed it over and over. If the door had opened, if that thing had touched the frame, then it had been inside his home. If only for a moment. That day, Daniel skipped work entirely, He sat in the kitchen, blinds drawn, all lights on, unable to shake the image of that pale hand. His phone buzzed with messages from coworkers asking if he was all right, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. He felt marked, chosen by whatever haunted this building. Running wouldn't help. He was certain of it now. Wherever he went, the corridor would follow. Late that evening, the old woman appeared again. He found her standing at the far end of the hallway, her nightgown trailing, her hair wild, her eyes wide with fear. She raised a trembling hand and beckoned him closer. Against his better judgment, Daniel stepped toward her, his heart pounding. When he reached her, she leaned in close, her breath sour and heavy. "They don't want you to leave," she whispered. "The corridor opens for the ones it keeps. You've walked it too long. You've listened. Now it listens to you." He grabbed her shoulders, desperate. "What are they? What do they want?" Her eyes rolled, white showing at the edges. "They want you to be part of them. Every tenant here. They all stayed too long. You'll stay too. The doors will close. The walls will eat your name." She pulled away suddenly, retreating into her unit, the door slamming shut behind her before he could respond. Daniel stood frozen in the dim hallway, his skin crawling. For the first time, he noticed that nearly every door bore deep scratches around the knob, as though countless hands had clawed at them, desperate to escape. When night returned, Daniel resolved to confront the corridor directly. He could no longer endure the waiting, the passive terror. He taped his phone to his chest so the camera pointed outward, ensuring everything he saw would be recorded. At 1:55 a.m., he opened his door and stepped into the hallway. The corridor stretched on endlessly before him, the single ceiling light buzzing faintly. He walked slowly, each footstep echoing, his breath shallow. As he passed door after door, he heard faint knocks from within, like imprisoned neighbors begging to be freed. Yet he knew no one lived there anymore. The air grew colder as he moved, the temperature dropping until mist puffed from his lips. At exactly 2:15 a.m., the lights above flickered. The corridor darkened, shadows swelling until the walls seemed to pulse. From ahead, a figure emerged, the same tall silhouette he had seen in the video. It glided toward him soundlessly, its face an empty void, its limbs bending wrong, too long, too loose. Daniel froze, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs betrayed him. The figure stopped inches away. Though it had no eyes, he felt it looking directly at him, peeling back the layers of his mind. Then it lifted one arm and extended that pale hand, the same hand from the video. It pressed its fingers against his chest, right where his phone rested. The device crackled violently, the screen bursting into static. The recording collapsing into shrieks of white noise. Daniel screamed and stumbled backward, tearing the phone from his chest, but the figure didn't follow. Instead, it tilted its head, as though curious, before melting into the wall like ink dissolving into paper. The corridor brightened again, the lights steadying, the air warming. Daniel collapsed to his knees, shaking, gasping for breath. When he reviewed the footage later, he found nothing but corrupted static from the moment he stepped into the hall. No figure, no sounds, no proof. Only him, trembling and alone. Daniel awoke at his kitchen table with the phone still clutched in his hand. His throat was raw, his chest ached from the screams he barely remembered releasing. Morning sunlight spilled through the blinds, painting harmless golden bars across the walls. For a fleeting moment, he convinced himself it had been a nightmare. But the phone in his palm, its screen spiderwebbed with cracks, reminded him otherwise. The device was dead, no matter how long he held the button. It was as though the corridor had killed it. He barely left the apartment that day. His hunger gnawed at him, but he couldn't bring himself to step outside. Every time he approached the door, he imagined the pale hand reaching in again, the knob turning against his will. He thought about calling someone, police, a friend, anyone, but what would he say? That his hallway was haunted? That a shadow with two long limbs had tried to claim him? No one would believe him. Worse, maybe someone would, and they'd lock him away in some padded room. By nightfall, exhaustion won out. He tried sleeping in the bedroom, but the silence pressed in too heavily, so he dragged his blanket to the living room and lay on the couch, television droning softly. Around midnight, his eyelids grew heavy. He almost slipped into real sleep when a sharp noise snapped him awake. A knock. Not at his door this time, but from the kitchen. He sat up slowly, the blanket slipping off. Another knock, 3 steady raps, came from the cabinet beneath the sink. His mouth dried as he rose, step by cautious step. He knelt, pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing. Then, so faint he thought he imagined it, a whisper seeped out. His name, Daniel, drawn out like a sigh. He staggered back, tripped over the coffee table, nearly fell. The knock came again, harder now, rattling the cabinet doors. He dashed for the apartment door, fumbling with locks, desperate to flee, but as he yanked it open, the corridor yawned before him. And it wasn't empty. Every door on the hallway had swung wide. From each threshold, figures emerged. Not neighbors, not people. Shadows shaped like them, black and faceless, their forms wavering as though barely held together. They turned toward him in unison, movements jerky, unnatural, like puppets tugged by unseen strings. Daniel slammed his door shut, locked every bolt, shoved a chair beneath the handle. His chest heaved as the shadows outside began to knock. First one door, then another, until the entire corridor boomed with pounding fists. The noise rose, a cacophony of thuds and scratches, claws dragging against wood. He covered his ears, curled into himself, rocking back and forth as the chair beneath his doorknob trembled with every hit. Hours seemed to pass that way, until at last the noise ceased. He lifted his head, shaking, ears ringing in the sudden quiet. Morning light had not yet returned. The clock read 3:44 a.m. He had nearly 3 more hours before dawn. He must have drifted into a daze because when the next sound came, it startled him so hard he bit his tongue. A voice, clear and cold, spoke directly through the door. "You don't belong outside anymore." Daniel's blood iced. His throat tightened, his mind screamed to deny it, but deep down he knew the words were true. The corridor wasn't just haunting him, it was absorbing him, pulling him into its reality. By the time morning came, Daniel had made a choice. He couldn't keep barricading himself forever. He had to understand what the corridor was, what it wanted. Maybe then he could escape or at least fight. He spent the day gathering supplies, a flashlight, a spare battery pack, bottles of water, and a pocket knife he found buried in a drawer. He stuffed them into his backpack, preparing like a man planning to descend into a cave. When night returned, Daniel didn't wait for the footsteps. At midnight sharp, he opened his door and stepped into the corridor. The silence greeted him like a predator. He clicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow tunnel of light. The hallway seemed longer tonight, stretching impossibly far, vanishing into darkness where there should have been an elevator. He walked anyway, his shoes squeaking against the scuffed linoleum. As he passed doors, he noticed each bore faint names scratched into the wood. Names of tenants, perhaps. But the names weren't painted or carved. They looked burned in, scorched letters that glowed faintly red, pulsing like embers. Some names he recognized from old mailboxes downstairs. Others were unfamiliar, their letters twisted, barely human. His name was there too. Halfway down the corridor, on his own door, the letters Daniel Hawthorne smoldered. He touched the wood and hissed at the heat. The corridor had claimed him already. The flashlight flickered. Daniel slapped it, panicked, and when the beam steadied again, he saw something at the far end. A door, not one he had ever noticed before. Tall, black, metal, its frame cracked and rusted. A faint humming came from beyond it, low and resonant, like the earth itself was groaning. Compelled, he approached. The closer he came, the colder the air grew, frost beginning to gather on the floor tiles. His breath fogged before him, his knuckles numb. He reached the black door, pressed his hand to the handle, and found it icy enough to burn. Still he turned it. The door opened onto darkness so deep it seemed alive. He raised the flashlight, but its beam was swallowed whole. Only the humming remained, louder now, vibrating in his bones. He stepped through. The corridor behind him vanished. He stood instead in a vast chamber, walls stretching up into nothing, floors glistening with a wet sheen. All around him, countless doors lined the walls, endless rows stacked upon one another, leading into voids. Some hung open, and from them figures peered out, pale hands gripping frames, faces twisted in eternal screams. They were tenants, he realized. Every vanished soul the building had ever claimed. Trapped, watching, waiting. In the center of the chamber stood the figure. Taller than before, clearer now. Its body was built from shadows stitched together, its face a shifting mass of hollows and eyes that blinked in and out. It reached for him, its voice spilling like oil into the chamber. "You walked the corridor. You opened the door. You are ours." Daniel raised the knife, though he knew it was laughable. Still, he screamed defiance, lunging forward, driving the blade into the figure's chest. The metal sank in with a sickening resistance, like plunging into mud. For a second, the creature shuddered. Then it laughed, a deep, echoing sound that shook the chamber. The knife melted in his hand, dripping into nothing. The creature leaned down, pressed its face close to his, and whispered, "The door is inside you now." Daniel felt a burning in his chest, searing pain that drove him to his knees. He clawed at himself, desperate to tear it out, but when he ripped open his shirt, he saw only a black mark spreading across his skin. A door, etched over his heart, glowing faintly red. The last thing he heard before collapsing was the endless knocking of 1,000 trapped hands, pounding from the other side of the door inside him. Daniel didn't remember waking. One moment he was on the floor of that impossible chamber, clutching the burning mark on his chest, and the next he was standing in his apartment again. Morning light streamed through the window, warm and ordinary, dust motes drifting lazily. For a heartbeat he thought it had all been a dream. Then he unbuttoned his shirt and saw the mark etched over his heart, an outline of a door, blackened and pulsing faintly as though it were alive. He staggered to the bathroom, splashed water on his face, stared into the mirror. His reflection seemed delayed, eyes blinking a fraction after he did, mouth curling into expressions he didn't make. When he lifted his hand, the reflection's fingers stretched too long, bending unnaturally, reaching for the glass. He stumbled back, shattering the mirror with his elbow. The pieces rained down, each shard reflecting a different version of himself, some screaming, some clawing at unseen walls, some pounding their fists against tiny glass corridors. For the rest of the day he sat in silence, trying to convince himself he still existed in the real world. His phone was gone, melted away in that chamber. His notebook lay on the coffee table, filled with frantic scribbles, names, times, sketches of doors. He flipped through the pages and realized some of the writing wasn't his. Scrawled between his neat notes were desperate messages in jagged script. "Let us out. The hallway never ends. You are next." His hand shook too violently to keep reading. That night he didn't wait. He knew the corridor would come for him regardless. At midnight he opened his door, stepped into the hall. The light overhead was dimmer than ever, buzzing weakly, as if it too were dying. The corridor stretched unnaturally long, its walls warping, its doors leaning. He walked barefoot, his skin prickling against the chill floor. As he moved, he realized the knocking had started again. Not from one door, but from every door, a chorus of fists pounding in rhythm. Voices rose behind them, muffled but urgent, screaming his name. He forced himself forward, his chest burning where the mark pulsed. The farther he went, the louder the knocking grew, until it felt like the entire building shook with the force of it. Then the doors burst open. One after another, shadows spilled out, faceless tenants dragging themselves into the hallway. Their forms flickered, shifting between human and inhuman, some crawling on all fours, some dragging broken limbs. They filled the corridor, converging behind him, driving him forward. He ran, his breath ragged, his heart thundering against the cursed door etched into his flesh. Ahead, the black metal door appeared again, humming with that low resonance. He didn't hesitate this time. He sprinted, slammed into it, and threw it open. The chamber swallowed him once more, endless doors stretching into infinity. But now it was alive with movement. Figures filled the thresholds, pounding their fists, shrieking with hollow mouths. The tall shadow creature stood at the center, waiting, its many eyes blinking in and out of existence. "You cannot fight the corridor," it said, its voice layered with 1,000 others. "You cannot flee. You are the corridor." Daniel shook his head, clutching his chest. "No, I'm still me." "I won't," the mark flared. His body arched with pain as the outline of the door widened, splitting open. He screamed, clutching at it, but his fingers sank into emptiness, as though his chest had become hollow. From within, a hand reached out. Not his own, not human. A pale skeletal hand clawed its way free, followed by another. They gripped his ribs like door frames, pulling. Daniel fell to his knees as the thing inside him forced itself out. A twisted version of himself crawled from the opening, taller, darker, face melted into shadow. Its eyes gleamed white, cruel and endless. It turned to him with a grin that stretched too wide. "This is the truth," it whispered. "You are the threshold. Through you, we enter." The creature stepped away, leaving Daniel collapsed, chest torn open, yet somehow still alive. He tried to crawl backward, tried to flee, but the chamber's shadows surged around him. One by one, the doors in the walls burst open and figures spilled out, rushing past him, pouring through the version of himself that had emerged. They vanished into him, using him as a gateway. He screamed until his throat shredded. His body convulsed as endless shapes passed through, each one leaving behind fragments, memories that weren't his, screams, pain, hunger. He felt himself unravel, his mind fracturing under the weight of thousands of stolen lives. And then, silence. Daniel opened his eyes and found himself standing in the corridor again. It looked normal, quiet, still, fluorescent lights humming softly. For a dizzy moment he thought he'd survived. But when he glanced at the doors, he realized each one bore his name now. Daniel Hawthorne, burned in letters across every apartment. He turned in a panic, and at the far end of the hall he saw a man step from an elevator, a stranger carrying groceries. The man glanced down the hall, saw Daniel, and froze.
"Hey,"
the stranger called nervously.
"do you live here?"
Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but what spilled out wasn't words. It was a chorus of voices, thousands overlapping, a roar of whispers and screams. The stranger paled, dropping his bags, backing into the elevator as the doors slid shut. Daniel stood motionless, watching. His chest pulsed, the door etched into him glowing brighter, and he understood. He wasn't a tenant anymore. He wasn't even Daniel anymore. He was the corridor itself, and the building would never let him go. The lights flickered once, and the knocking began again, spreading from door to door like fire. Behind each one, new voices cried to be free. And Daniel, or what remained of him, listened with a smile too wide for his face. The corridor had claimed another.